From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. A conversation with the presenter of the Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems Lecture here at K-State last evening. A longtime editor for National Geographic magazine, Dimick, discusses the implications of humanity's expanding presence in the world, most notably for food production systems. Dennis will share his perceptions on agriculture's role in rebalancing the carbon cycle while continuing to feed an ever-growing world population. Also in today, K-State's Charlie Lee to look this week at the research-tested performance of a new repellent for discouraging snakes from entering homes and outbuildings. Plus more ahead on this Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. You're tuned into the K-State Radio Network, and welcome once more to Agriculture Today. We've been promoting this, and it took place earlier on the Kansas State University campus, the 2019 Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems Lecture here at the university. Just to remind, the stated mission of this series is to provide science-based education about global food systems. It allows everyone taking it in to interact with U.S. as well as international food industry leaders. And once more, it is named for the longtime leader and innovator in the Kansas beef cattle industry, Henry Gardiner, of the Gardiner Angus Ranch near Ashland in southwest Kansas. Invited to present the lecture this time, an individual who has a quite unique perspective on our food systems and how they tie into the environment. He spent 35 years with National Geographic magazine, many of those as the executive environmental editor for National Geographic, and he shared a message on the human age and how global food systems relate to that. Dennis Dimick is his name. Dennis, good to have you here at the K-State campus.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here this week.
And you have an agricultural background unto yourself, do you not?
That's correct. So I grew up on a small, by Kansas standards, only 80-acre sheep, hay, and cattle farm in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, just south of Portland. I was involved in raising purebred and registered Suffolk sheep, baled hay to earn money to go to college, and then studied. I was originally planning to be a teacher of high school vocational agriculture, and then when I was a sophomore in college, I bought a camera, and that changed the direction of my life. I did graduate in agriculture from Oregon State and agricultural journalism from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but that background actually put me in a good position to then start studying environmental issues around the world.
And eventually you headed down a path toward working for National Geographic. Visit about that a bit, if you would.
Sure. So after finishing school in 1974, I then returned to the Pacific Northwest, where I worked as a newspaper photographer. In Corvallis, I was the sports editor at the McMinnville paper. I was a photographer at the newspapers in Pendleton, Oregon, and in Walla Walla, Washington. And then in 1978, I moved to Louisville, Kentucky, and worked 2 years at the Courier-Journal, where I was a picture editor and was responsible for working with photographers and with the news editors to shape the visual presentation, the visual report. And then in 1980, I received a phone call and was asked to apply for a job that was open at the National Geographic Society.
And you were successful in landing that position, obviously.
Apparently, yes. Yes, and so it was a long story that I don't need to go into, but at least I can say that it was the the 35 years at National Geographic were fascinating for me. It was like having a career-long. Imagine being in graduate school for 35 years. It was a wonderful place for me. I was the child of two fisheries biologists. I grew up in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest. My mom also was a librarian. We were surrounded by books at our house, so there was this always insatiable curiosity about new ideas and exploration of new ways of looking at the world, and so that was actually a perfect match for a career at the National Geographic.
You traveled then the nation and the world as a reporter, as a gatherer of photography, obviously, and eventually as the environmental editor. So for the layperson out there, tell what that's like on a routine basis.
Sure. Well, I need to go back and correct the record a bit here. It wasn't that I did so much traveling. I was the one who sat in the office, drove the desk, came up with the ideas, figured out where to get the money, and then organized in collaboration with photographers like my good friend Jim Richardson from Lindsborg, Kansas. We would then organize projects, and then it would be writers and photographers like Jim who would go out in the field, and then they would come back with their pictures and their words, and I was then my primary role as a picture editor was to shape that report, organize it into a coherent narrative that made sense. This was more than just about pictures, but we were telling stories, and pictures were being used in service to that. And then along the way, I because of my own background, then agriculture, my parents, I had an abiding interest in environmental issues. I think that probably stems from the fact that when I was just finishing high school, half of our farm was taken away by eminent domain and turned into an interstate highway. So I understood quite clearly what happens, the impact of progress and what it does on the environment. So that set me along, and so then for well over a decade, I was then involved in originating and orchestrating a large number of magazine stories on a variety of issues like climate change, its relationship to the energy choices that we make, emerging freshwater scarcity, the implications of world population. We did a year-long series on population when population crossed 7 billion in 2011. And then in 2014-15, then we were involved in producing a multi-year series on the future of food, asking the question, how will we feed the planet at mid-century and beyond?
This is getting right into the message that you presented at the Gardiner lecture, which we want to expand on. Just a quick aside here, among your assignments over the years, you became familiar with agriculture in the High Plains region by a couple of stories regarding the Ogallala Aquifer, correct?
Absolutely. So in the early 90s, I was involved with Jim Richardson in a story where we were looking at the Ogallala Aquifer, the role that it played in helping agriculture in the High Plains to exist. And then in 2016, the magazine went back and re-examined the health of the aquifer. I also was involved in a story that I collaborated with Jim on just looking at the Great Plains and how the people who live on the plains and rely on what the plains can grow, how people have come to terms with the abilities of this semi-arid landscape to provide food and agricultural harvests, especially in light of the fact that the Great Plains also was the location of one of the biggest environmental disasters that we had seen in North America after the plains were plowed up and the Dust Bowl took the soils away.
You take a comprehensive look at things, though. That's an important facet of the work that's done here.
Absolutely, and I think that for example, what I was trying to do in the lecture the other night was to try to integrate all of these ideas into what might be called a coherent narrative. So around the year 2000, there was a Dutch chemist, his name is Paul Crutzen, who had won a Nobel Prize for his work, and he was saying that we had moved out of the Holocene, which was the current geologic age, and into what could be called the Anthropocene or the human age. And the idea really was that we humans have become the dominant species on Earth, that we have transformed landscapes, that we're affecting the atmosphere, that we're depleting the oceans. There are many characteristics when you look at, if you look at a variety of indicators about the ecological health of the planet, that humans, we have tripled our population since 1950, from 2.5 billion when I was born to more than 7.5 billion now. And really this whole idea that Crutzen put forth and what I was discussing the other evening in my lecture was to try to integrate all of those issues that I mentioned earlier, climate, energy, water, population, food, into a coherent tale that helps us understand how did we get to where we are today. Here we are, we're taking advantage of the electricity that allows us to talk here. I was the beneficiary of oil to be able to come here today. We've all been beneficiaries of this. And slowly but increasingly, we are also seeing that there are byproducts or impacts from our human transformation of the planet. And one of those is that we've been changing the chemistry of the atmosphere. We've been changing the chemistry of nearshore water environments with, say, nutrient runoffs. And so I take a look at those and what does that mean for us? What trajectories are we on? And what are the kinds of potential changes in our activities that we might need to contemplate as we, especially as our children and theirs, take over from us and have to deal with the world that we've created.
I'd like to dig into a little more of that if we might, Dennis, but we need to take a break. If you'd stand by, we'll continue. As we're visiting with Dennis Dimick, he is now the former executive environmental editor for National Geographic magazine, some 35 years at that August publication, and he is sharing a message while at K-State on the human age and how that relates to food security and the environmental impact. And we'll talk more with Dennis after this break. You're tuned to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Our special guest joining us today once again presented the 2019 Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems Lecture here at Kansas State University. Dennis Dimick, formerly of National Geographic magazine, and he talked with the audience there about the human age and how it has impacted our environment and our ability to feed an ever-growing population. Dennis, one of the things that could be considered the centerpiece of your discussion, the state of the carbon cycle. You might expand on that.
Certainly. So actually, one of the early stories that I did as the environmental editor at National Geographic was to try to understand the carbon cycle and how we're affecting it. And everything in the world is connected to it. And what's fascinating is that if you look at all animals, we're about half carbon. And the plants, carbon is the one element that goes through everything that's living. That's why when you talk about organic chemistry, that's carbon-based chemistry. And what's fascinating now is that for the longest time, until about 300 years ago, human society powered civilization by water wheels on streams powering mills, windmills powering pumps, all of those things, and cutting and burning of wood, for example. All of that was really all of that we were beneficiaries of a contemporary carbon cycle. But then what happened about 300 years ago, we began to realize that there was ancient carbon buried in the ground. Ancient carbon in the form of coal, oil, and gas. And that actually was as if we had dug up a genie and had unlocked something that had transformed the world. And those fuels have allowed human civilization to prosper, for the world population to expand. A little more than 1 century ago, 2 German chemists, Haber and Bosch, invented a process for being able to synthesize nitrogen from the atmosphere, the nitrogen being the dominant element in the atmosphere, taking N2 and turning it into reactive nitrogen that we could use for plant food. And that underpinned a radical transformation in the ability of world food production to expand its yields. That, combined with the easy availability of oil, allowed for a significant uptick in the mechanization of agriculture. Horses were no longer needed. It allowed us to transform landscapes all over the world. And as you had easy availability of energy, carbon-based energy, you were able to grow more food. More people are on the planet. And as we go along, though, all of those benefits we're coming to realize. The scientific community for decades has been studying that there have been rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is a byproduct of the combustion of these very powerful fuels that have allowed us to create the world that we're living in. But now we're beginning to see byproducts from that are, as the chemistry of the atmosphere has changed, as the planet traps more heat near the surface, we're beginning to see things like shifts in growing seasons. We're seeing changes in precipitation patterns. We're seeing ice sheets are melting. It's causing shorelines to shift along continents as sea levels rise. We're beginning to see, actually, for all the benefits, we're now realizing that we're probably going to have to start paying the piper for all of the benefits that we've gotten from essentially disrupting the carbon cycle.
So is part of the message here to endorse or encourage a better balance in the carbon cycle, if you will, to retain the benefits of hiked food production, for instance, while trying to alleviate the environmental negatives?
Sure. So I think that what we need to contemplate is how can we continue to go forward, but also by producing energy without producing carbon emissions. That's why there's been such a big push towards what's called renewable energy, that you're producing kilowatts without producing more carbon. Also, the quest or the pressure to try to remove carbon from the atmosphere. We've seen recent work underway that's advocating for an agriculture that is perhaps trying to soak up more carbon, store more carbon in the soil. All of these things, and it's a combination of things between renewable energy. Maybe it's family planning and education of girls in some countries, because that can have an impact on how many people are born on the planet. It's a whole variety of things, and I've laid that out in the talk as I gave Monday night.
When you look at production agriculture currently, Dennis, has inroads been made toward some of these objectives? We see no-till crop production. We see efforts to develop soil health by use of, say, cover crops, water conservation measures. Are there steps in this direction being taken?
I think all of those things that you mentioned are important advances. From my view, I think also that it's important to realize that given the changes that we're seeing in the global, call it extreme weather, if you will, that agriculture itself is highly dependent upon, you could call it a Goldilocks environment, not too hot, not too cold, just the right amount of rain at just the right time. Agriculture is a huge enterprise, but it's also very vulnerable. And we can practice all of the improvements that you've mentioned, but one of my biggest concerns has to do with the vulnerability of agriculture to the climatic shifts that we're seeing. And we can adapt. We talk about this as being a two-pronged challenge. On one hand, we hear the word mitigate, which really means to cut carbon emissions. to reduce the amount of carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere from our activities. And that's absolutely important, because if you can't cut carbon emissions, no amount of adaptation will save you. But as far as adapting, agriculture is vulnerable because of the shifts in weather. For example, we saw what happened with that bomb cyclone in Nebraska in March this year. There are fields in Nebraska and in Iowa that are still flooded and out of production. And so you have, in this changing environment, it's, yes, absolutely, we need to figure out ways to reduce our carbon emissions, but we also need to be sensitive to the fact that agriculture itself is vulnerable to the changes that we're seeing.
There are no simple answers, though, are there? These things just don't fall into place in regard to reducing that carbon footprint, if you will.
No, not at all. And the impacts, though, are also not linear either. And that's perhaps one of the big unknowns. This question about, we keep thinking, oh, well, the planet is slowly warming, and we certainly do have the temperature records that indicate that 18 of the last 19 years have been the hottest years recorded since we have started making weather observations since the late 1800s. And all of that has an impact, but it's not just what we're seeing now. It's not just a linear change. We're actually seeing as you have an atmosphere that is able to carry more water because it's warmer, we're seeing increasingly extreme events. For example, just on July 8th in my town, we had never seen this before. In Arlington, Virginia, we got 3.3 inches of rain in 1 hour. And that kind of event we're seeing more and more, and it's overwhelming the systems that we have built. And more we have to start planning not so much for the averages, but for the extremes.
Dennis, as a parting thought here, it sounds as if your message about what's happening with the environment, with agricultural systems and so forth, is less one of alarm and more of an awareness.
I would say it's about awareness. It's the need to understand why we need to, in as many ways as possible, to decarbonize as we can, but also to build resilience, and if you would call it Plan B, into the way we live on the planet.
Can we get there?
I don't think we have a choice. So I'm almost 70 years old. I have 2 children, and the question is, can we begin to start moving in a direction that allows our children and theirs to have live in an environment that is livable?
Great presentation during the Henry C. Gardiner lecture. I also appreciate your comments right here and the introspect you bring to the table on these very important matters. Dennis, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me here today.
The presenter of the 2019 Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems Lecture at Kansas State University. Once again, 35 years at National Geographic magazine. Among the capacities there is the executive environmental editor for National Geographic. Dennis Dimick presenting the lecture this year. Now, if you didn't catch Dennis's presentation last evening, the video of it is now archived on the lecture series website. Technically, the K-State Global Food Systems site, but the easiest way to get to that is simply search for Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems Lecture. You'll find this year's lecture as well as the 5 previous lectures. Those include Sarah Minker of Grow Intelligence, Rob Fraley of Monsanto, Greg Page of Cargill, Jay Famiglietti of the University of California, Irvine, and Jason Clay of the World Wildlife Fund. All those archived at the website. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. Now, this break. We'll return with today's agricultural news headlines and more right here on the K-State Radio Network. Please do keep it right here.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson back with you and with today's agricultural news headlines now. These courtesy in part of DTN. The extent of that good news for the trade outlook with China, reported over the weekend, remains a tad murky. Yesterday, some media outlets were reporting that China had not actually confirmed elements of the deal earlier touted by the U.S. administration. A little later then, Bloomberg reported that China, quote, wants to hold more talks this month to hammer out the details of the Phase 1 trade deal before Xi Jinping agrees to sign it. That report cited people familiar with the matter. Beijing, says Bloomberg, may send a delegation led by Vice Premier Liu He, China's top negotiator, to finalize the written deal that could be signed by the presidents at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit next month in Chile. Now, another report said China also wants the U.S. to scrap the planned tariff hike in December, in addition to the hike which was scheduled for this week, something the administration has not yet endorsed. Mainly, these sources are citing asking not to be named, discussing the private negotiations. China's Ministry of Commerce merely said that the two sides have made substantial progress and agreed to work together in the direction of a final agreement. The state-run Xinhua news agency did not mention a deal at all, according to Bloomberg. The editor-in-chief of the Global Times in China, Hu Jin, said in a tweet that, quoting here, China-U.S. trade talks made a breakthrough last week, and the two sides have the strong will to reach a final deal. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said yesterday in a TV broadcast that he expects officials to work in the coming weeks to get the first stage ready for both sides to sign. If that doesn't happen, the new U.S. import taxes on Chinese products will be imposed, says Mnuchin, starting on December the 15th. Deere & Company is spending billions of dollars annually to buy its own equipment for a leasing program which lifts sales of new farm tractors but adds financial complexity and is weighing on the used equipment market. The world's largest manufacturer of farm equipment has leaned on its financing business in recent years to combat declining demand for new machinery at a time of economic stress in U.S. farm country. The transaction records show that more than one-third of the financed purchases of Deere high-horsepower tractors are being leased to farmers. Deere's financing business, the owner of about 90% of that leased equipment. Leasing levels are about double the rate of back in 2012, when Deere was booming because of high crop prices. The leases allow Deere to bump up sales by delivering machinery to customers who might not be willing to buy in the soft market, but the longer-term risk to the company is that many customers will continue to prefer leasing when the farm economy rebounds, and leasing offers less reliable profit and more complexity than lending customers money with interest to pay for their equipment purchases. Next up on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of Milk Lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning the teat-in health within their dairy herd. As we feel the chill of fall starting to come on in mornings, it's important for us to start thinking about teat-in health and how that's going to be impacted in the next several months. If we prepare ahead of time, we will be much more likely to survive the challenges that the teat-ins see during this time of the year. Some of the things that you need to keep in mind as you think about this is when we have temperature swings that exceed more than 30 degrees Fahrenheit, we're very likely to see chapping of the teat-ins. Now, there's some things we can do to reduce this, but bottom line is the teat-in skin will actually react to those temperature changes. So first, how do you measure that? Well, we can do teat-in scoring. Many of you do that on your farms. If you don't, you probably should get some information and maybe start paying attention to what do those teat-ins actually look like in your herd. When we start to see teat-in scores of 3s and 4s, that will mean that we are also seeing an increase in somatic cell count. This is due to the fact that the teat-ins are now more difficult to clean. We have more bacteria that are harbored at the end of the teat, and as a result of that, we may see an increase in mastitis, clinical cases, but we'll also see an increase in somatic cell count within the herd. So what are some things that you can do to help improve the teat-in health? Well, the first thing you need to do is make sure that your milking equipment is adjusted properly. Teat-in vacuum levels are very, very important. So if these have not been checked recently on your milking system, they really need to be checked to make sure that the system is operating properly. Second thing that really causes us some issues are pulsators. Pulsators are notorious for having issues. If we're not on a regular maintenance program, fairly likely there's some pulsators within your parlor, even this morning or this evening as you're milking animals, that are not working correctly. So again, getting on top of the equipment maintenance on your farm is very, very important. Now, some other things that we can do. We can consider what we're using as a post-dip product on the teat-ins. Some of these products contain more skin conditioners and lanolin and other things that actually help increase the integrity of the teat-in skin. This will allow it to heal if it is chapped already, but it'll also help prevent chapping. Need to start using these types of dips prior to the challenge, though. So, as you think about that, when should you start using winterized type teat dips? A lot of times we'll wait until the day before we see the temperature take a big drop. However, we probably ought to start 2 to 3 weeks prior to that. So anytime in the next month or so would be probably a good time to start those winterized teat dips if you really expect to protect the skin from that initial chapping that we get in the fall. Some other things to consider as you look at where the cows exit your milking parlor. One of the issues that we have is in very cold weather where we have wind, as those cows exit the milking parlor and walk back to their housing area, they may encounter an area where the wind can hit the teat-ins. Keep in mind that as the cows leave the milking parlor, the circulation of blood within the teats is lower than what it normally is due to the effect of the milking machine. Therefore, teat skin will freeze quicker or will chap quicker because of this. So, make sure you install windbreaks to protect animals from wind as they walk from the milking parlor back to their housing area. Very important in preventing frozen teat-ins in very cold weather, but also helping to reduce the chapping of teat-ins when we have more moderate temperatures. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to pay attention to teat-in condition as we move from fall into winter.
Thanks, Mike, as always. This is Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
This Agriculture Today closes out with our weekly wildlife management segment. Once again, along with us is wildlife specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, a look today at repelling snakes as they seek winter sanctuary indoors or in outbuildings, wherever it might be. You typically get calls about this time of the year.
Yes, this is the time of year snakes and rodents may be finding their way indoors, starting to have a major weather change. Critters that need to be protected from severe winter are looking for a place to stay warm. So consequently, people object to sharing their living quarters with snakes and rodents and often look for ways to repel them. When we talk about wildlife, I try to get folks to think about the acronym HER, HER. H would stand for habitat modification, E or for exclusion, and R for removal. And then almost all management alternatives that solve wildlife problems will fall somewhere within those categories of habitat modification, exclusion, or removal.
Let's talk about habitat then and what folks can do to deter snakes from entering a building.
Well, the first thing to do is figure out what species of snake you have, because habitat modification would include trying to remove the food or the cover that the snakes are finding useful. If you're trying to prevent snakes from coming in, one of the easiest ways is to have a more of a barren area on the outside of the home. So learn some species identification. When we look at the wide range of species we have in Kansas, we have snakes that eat birds or bird eggs, to snakes that eat insects, to other snakes that eat earthworms or other snakes or rodents. So in order to remove all of those from an environment, you must identify what species you're talking about. Typically, when we talk about removing the cover, it's just a matter of reducing the hiding places, mowing it short, reducing some of the landscape so that you have more open areas at ground level. That's going to modify the habitat and reduce the likelihood of snakes being up against the dwelling. But when that doesn't work, you think about exclusion. There are lots of different fence designs out there that are designed to prevent snakes. Typically, they're a solid barrier that angles outward so that a snake is not able to climb up. If it's a purely vertical structure, many snakes can simply scale to the top of that. The fence also would have to be buried. So that would be how you would exclude snakes. But it's a fairly labor-intensive and expensive proposition, so it's not often utilized. So next would be trying to repel snakes from an area with some sort of a chemical product.
And there are quite a few of those out there on the market?
Yes, that's not a new concept, but we've had a difficult time identifying compounds that were effective. There have been products out there for many years, liquid fence, shoe snake, snake away. Depending on what testimonial that you look at, in my opinion, they would have limited effectiveness at best. Those products have been tested on venomous and non-venomous snake species. But there is a new compound that's being tested called milorganite. It's an organic, slow-release fertilizer product from heat-dried microbes that have digested organic material in the Milwaukee, Wisconsin wastewater. Then those are dried down and sold as a organic fertilizer. It's fairly low in nitrogen, only 6%, 4% phosphorus, and less than 1% potassium. It's been tried as a deer repellent, probably less than satisfactory results there, but again, in order to evaluate a repellent, you need to look at lots of other things in the environment that may cause the animal to move elsewhere.
But this was recently tested for its efficacy in repelling snakes, you say?
Yes, this was the milorganite was a product that was tested in Georgia in a natural environment situation where they confined snakes in a 30 by 30 meter enclosure that had been dug in at the bottom. It was a solid landscape type material that was the fencing. It had some electric wires also to keep snakes from crawling over the top. The fence itself was thought that it would be effective at confining snakes, so they captured non-venomous black rat snakes. The rat snakes then were kept in confinement until they had 5 to 7 snakes. Then the snakes were fitted with radio transmitters, put into the exclosure, and turned loose and monitored their movements. Keep in mind this was supposed to be a snake-proof exclosure. All snakes escaped within a little over 9 hours, and the first 2 cohorts of snakes that had been placed into the enclosure. So next they took 2 pounds of milorganite and applied it in a 8-inch barrier around the perimeter of that enclosure, and then put in the next 5 to 7 snakes and monitored their movement. All snakes remained within the enclosure for 7 days after they had applied the milorganite. The results then indicated that milorganite wasn't effective as a repellent for rat snakes under the circumstances in which they applied it here. I would suspect that in a more of a natural environment, that perhaps everyone's not going to get 100% efficacy, but it may be a product that some wish to try.
So might want to look into that. Milorganite is the name of the product, but utilizing all three methods is probably the best means of deterring snakes and warding them away from an outbuilding or a home.
Yes, it's been my experience after doing this for almost 30 years that typically there are a lot of options out there. You may have to try several before you find one that's effective.
But, in fact, this new research would indicate that this repellent product, milorganite, could be part of the answer to keeping snakes away from your homes and your outbuildings as winter comes on. And many thanks, Charlie, as always, for the information. He's Charlie Lee, Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, and our regular Tuesday guest. Our time's away for today. Again, do check out our podcast service for listening to the broadcast when you're out of earshot of this affiliate, or for automatic downloading on your mobile device. Find out all about it at agtoday.net, agtoday.net. Meantime, please be back with us right here tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.